When good news becomes bad news, Canada's jobs boom, America's slowdown, and the Hormuz threat to the global economy. Hello, and welcome to GAF, Global Affairs Forum. I'm Zainab Koroma, and this is Global Crossroads, where we connect the events reshaping our world and ask not only what is happening, but why it matters and what comes next. Today is Saturday, August 8th, 2026. Global financial markets are closed, but the world economy is certainly not standing still. In fact, the developments of the past 48 hours reveal an increasingly unusual and potentially dangerous economic configuration. Canada has just delivered a surprisingly strong employment report. The Toronto stock market has reached another record high. South of the border, however, the United States has unexpectedly lost jobs, even while Wall Street is also trading at record levels. And thousands of kilometers away, the Strait of Hormuz remains severely disrupted despite diplomatic efforts to reopen it. Put those developments together, and we have an extraordinary global contradiction. Economic growth is becoming less secure. Inflation remains too high. Stock markets are setting records. Trade barriers are increasing. And one of the world's most important energy arteries remains caught in a geopolitical confrontation. So tonight the question is, are we moving toward a new phase of the global economy, one in which conflict and supply disruptions keep inflation elevated? Because if the answer is yes, central banks may soon face their most difficult problem since the inflation shock of the early 2020s. Let's begin in Canada. Canada's July employment report delivered a major upside surprise. According to Reuters, employment increased by approximately 75,100 in July. Economists had expected just 16,500. That is not a small forecasting miss. Employment growth was more than 4 times expectations, and the unemployment rate declined to 6.4%. This was not just a part-time story. Full-time employment rose by 38,600, and average hourly wages were up about 3% from a year earlier. This matters enormously. Canada is still going through a significant mortgage renewal cycle, refinancing at considerably higher rates. As long as Canadians remain employed, households have a better chance of absorbing that shock. Lose the job and mortgage renewal stress can become delinquency. But Canada's economic picture is sending 2 messages. While employment is strong, the Ivy Purchasing Managers Index fell to a 4-month low. Meanwhile, the manufacturing PMI rose to 53.5, its strongest reading in years, supported by domestic demand. But international demand remained weak, and manufacturers faced rising input costs linked to tariffs and Middle East tensions. Canada is not an economic island. The United States is its most important market, and Canada cannot remain insulated from an American deterioration. This brings us to the most important Canadian external risk. Ottawa and Washington are negotiating ahead of a potential tariff escalation on August 19th. The Trump administration has announced new 50% tariffs affecting nearly $20 billion of Canadian products, including steel and aluminum. This illustrates a truth about tariffs. The country imposing them does not automatically win. Costs are redistributed across producers and consumers on both sides. For Ontario manufacturing in particular, this integrated supply chain makes them incredibly vulnerable to these disruptions. Investors, however, remain optimistic. The S&P/TSX ended Friday at a record high, its strongest weekly performance in 4 months. But across the border, the opposite is happening. The U.S. economy unexpectedly lost 23,000 non-farm jobs in July. Previous months were revised downward by 103,000. The 4.1% unemployment rate is misleading, as people simply left the labor force. This changes the conversation around the Federal Reserve. Before the report, a rate increase was likely. Now those odds have plummeted. But inflation has not disappeared. Core PCE inflation remains at 3.3%, well above the Fed's 2% objective. This is stagflationary pressure. And that brings us to the most immediate global danger. The Strait of Hormuz remains in a state of diplomatic and military tension. The UAE accused Iran of a missile attack against an ADNOC vessel. ADNOC has reported 15 missile and drone attacks since the conflict began. A diplomatic agreement on paper is not normalization. Ships require security, insurers require confidence, and crews require safety. Why does it matter? Hormuz represents more than 1/4 of global seaborne oil trade and 1/5 of global LNG trade. Asia bears disproportionate exposure, and the consequences travel rapidly, affecting grocery prices in Toronto and transportation in Lagos. One Indian example, a supertanker voyage that used to cost $2 million now costs $25 million. Someone has to pay that premium. For lower-income, oil-importing nations, an energy shock can weaken the currency, making dollar-denominated oil even more expensive. The IMF described the energy shock as effectively a sudden tax on national income. For countries already coping with high debt, there is no painless option. Now we arrive at the Wall Street paradox. The U.S. loses jobs, and the stock market rises to another record. Investors interpret weaker employment as reducing the probability of rate hikes. But at some point, they will start worrying about corporate earnings. The test comes next week with the U.S. CPI release. If inflation is hotter than expected while payrolls are weak, the soft landing narrative could fail. There are at least 3 plausible scenarios from here: diplomatic de-escalation, muddling through, or a stagflationary shock. The stagflationary shock, with oil above $100 and U.S. employment contracting, is the scenario policymakers cannot afford to ignore. Over the coming weeks, watch the numbers. These risk thresholds provide an early warning dashboard for the global economy. I'm Zainab Koroma for Global Affairs Forum. Thank you for joining us on Global Crossroads. Good night.